Welcome to today's webinar in the Knowledge Mile series, part of the Lord Mayor's lectures on behalf of Professor Michael Mainelli, whose theme for his mayoral year is Connect to Prosper. In this free online lecture series, we address the connections in and around the square mile, which Michael likes to call the world's coffee house, and how these might help us to tackle future global challenges. I'm Professor Tim Connell, Chairman of the Gresham Society and a Fellow of Gresham College here in the City of London, and I also sit on the court of the Stationers' Company. So I'll be convening this session and moderating the questions and answers after today's lecture. So this is the plan for today. Quick introduction from me, the main presentation by Bob McDowell, and we will have time for questions and answers. Really interesting topic today. Delighted to have Bob McDowell with us, who is a big city man with a background in law and finance. He's a liveryman and former court assistant at the Tin Plate Workers and also a member of the Gresham Society. Bob, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about yourself just to get started.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Tim. Yes, I have a background in law and finance and business, and I still continue to write on matters concerning business and give the occasional lecture. I also I live in the Channel Islands in Alderney, where I was head of the government, chairman of the main committee. Alderney is a small Channel island, which some would delight calling a parish council posing as a jurisdiction. I've also been president of the Folklore Society, which may be tangential to some of the subject material I'm covering today. And I also am a fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute. I sit on its finance and investment committee. So I have quite a varied life, so to speak.
Indeed.
I'm delighted to be doing this lecture.
Well, we're delighted too, Bob, because viewers will remember that Bob surprised us all with his lecture last November on Judge Jeffries, where he managed to persuade us that he wasn't such a bad chap after all, and very convincing he was too. Bob, that is, of course, not Judge Jeffries. So now, Bob, can you tell us why Sir Isaac Newton is a key historical figure and rather more complex than we think today? And will you be doing a hatchet job on him as well this time?
Well, I shall be focusing a little bit on his personality. But anyway, let me begin. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. And I think I should, by way of introduction, set out why I chose this subject, as well as providing a brief insight into some unsolicited responses from academia, which I received when the lecture was posted on the Lord Mayor's Knowledge Mile website. Some of the audience who regularly watch the lecture may recollect that I gave a previous lecture in this series on Lord Jeffries, Judge Jeffries, the judge who successively was Lord Chief Justice and Lord Chancellor during the latter part of the reign of Charles II and during the reign of James II. And during researches for that lecture, the interaction of Lord Jeffries and Isaac Newton in connection with Sir Isaac Newton's experiments with alchemy emerged. Equally, I'm aware of the fragile relationship which Sir Isaac Newton had with Sir Robert Hooke, the English polymath who was an active physicist, astronomer, geologist, meteorologist, and architect. But both sets of these interactions reveal, in my view, a fragile and often unbalanced aspect of Sir Isaac Newton's character. Though I do appreciate some may observe that that is the same with all famous people, and especially those of genius. Quite to my surprise, the notice and abstract of this lecture prompted 3 unsolicited offers of research material from academics, whose academic institutions would not permit them to publish researches on the less fragrant aspects of Sir Isaac Newton under the auspices of their universities. I've been unable to ascertain whether the said academic institutions do not like their staff to criticise what I'll term national treasures like Sir Isaac Newton, or whether there are more sinister reasons, but I'll leave people to conjecture on that. Anyway, let me set out, I think it's important to set a very potted biography of Sir Isaac Newton. He was born in 1643 in Lincolnshire, son of a farmer who died early in his life, and he spent most of his years with his maternal grandmother after his mother remarried. His education was interrupted by a failed attempt to turn him into a farmer, believe it or not. And then he attended King's School in Grantham before enrolling at the University of Cambridge's Trinity College in 1661. Newton studied a classical curriculum at Cambridge, but became fascinated with the works of modern philosophers such as Descartes, even devoting notes to his outside readings, which he entitled Certain Philosophical Questions. When the Great Plague shuttered Cambridge in 1665, Newton returned home and began formulating his theories on calculus, light, and colour, and his farm was the setting of the supposed falling apple that inspired his work on gravity. Newton returned to Cambridge in 1667 and was elected to a minor fellowship, and he constructed the first telescope in 1660, reflecting telescope in 1668, and the following year he received his master's degree and took over as Cambridge's Lucasian Professor of Mathematics. Asked to give a demonstration of his telescope to the Royal Society of London in 1671, he achieved a note and was elected to the Royal Society the following year and published his notes on optics for his peers. Through his experiments with refraction, Newton determined that white light was the composite of all colours of the spectrum, and he asserted that light was composed of particles instead of waves. But his method drew sharp rebuke from established society member Robert Hooke, whom I'm going to discuss in this lecture, who was unsparing in his criticism of Newton, both at the time and then in follow-up papers. Now, Newton was known for his temperamental defence of his work. He engaged in heated correspondence with Hooke before suffering a nervous breakdown and withdrawing from the public eye in 1678. In the following year, he returned to his earlier studies on the forces governing gravity and dabbled in alchemy. In 1684, the astronomer Edmund Halley of comets fame paid a visit to the secluded Newton. Upon learning that Newton had mathematically worked out the elliptical paths of celestial bodies, Halley urged him to organize his notes, and the result was a publication, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, in 1687, which established the three laws of motion and the law of universal gravity. Principia propelled Newton to stardom in intellectual circles, eventually earning universal acclaim as one of the most important works of modern science. His work was the foundation of the European Enlightenment. And with his newfound influence, Newton opposed the attempts of King James II to reinstitute Catholic teachings at universities. King James was replaced subsequently, of course, by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange as part of the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And at that time, Newton was elected to represent Cambridge in Parliament and took his seat in 1689. Newton, slightly by surprise, moved to London permanently after being named Warden of the Royal Mint in 1696 and earning promotion to Master of the Mint 3 years later. And determined to prove his position wasn't merely symbolic, Newton moved the pound sterling from silver to the gold standard and sought to punish counterfeiters, which is somewhat ironic based on his alchemy experiments. The death of Hooke in 1703 allowed Newton to take over the president of the Royal Society, and the following year he published his second major work, Optics. Composed largely of his earlier notes on the subject, the book detailed Newton's painstaking experiments with the refraction and colour spectrum, closing with his ruminations on such matters as energy and electricity. And in 1705 he was knighted by the Queen of England, Queen Anne. But Newton was also an ardent student of history and religious doctrines, and his writings on these subjects were compiled into multiple books that were published posthumously. Having never married, Newton spent his latter years living with his niece near Winchester and died in his sleep in 1727 and was buried in Westminster. Now let's look at some of Newton's frailties as revealed by his interactions, first of all with Lord Jeffries. In that we may conclude some very interesting comments. Maynard Keynes discovered to his horror, when he purchased private papers of his hero Sir Isaac Newton from Trinity College in the 1930s, that Newton was a closet alchemist. To quote Maynard Keynes, in the 18th century and since that time, Newton came to be thought of as the first and greatest of modern scientists, a rationalist, one who taught us to think on lines of cold and untinctured reason. I do not see him in this slide. I do not think anyone who has pored over the content of that which he packed when he finally left Cambridge in 1696, that is his notes on his alchemy experiments, and which, though partly dispersed, have come to us now, can see Newton like that. Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians. Quite, in my view, a damning statement from Maynard Keynes. The private papers detailing Newton's alchemy experiments, many written in code because he conducted these experiments in secret, also contained papers setting out his tactics for appearing before Lord Jeffries. For Lord Jeffries somehow had been tipped off about Newton's alchemy experiments, which is interesting because Newton kept his alchemy secret. He wrote to fellow alchemist Robert Boyle a letter urging him to keep high silence in publicly discussing the principles of alchemy, because the way by which the mercurial principle may be impregnated has been thought fit to be concealed by others that have known it, and therefore may possibly be an inlet to something more noble. The very curious correspondence between Boyle and Newton. And curiously enough, Robert Boyle successfully lobbied for the repeal of what was the Multipliers Act of 1399, which had outlawed the practice of alchemy. Very, very ironic with his friends. But Lord Jeffries' concern about alchemy was the prospective economic turmoil that alchemy could bring to a fragile economy. One must remember that one of Lord Jeffries' key roles was to protect the restored Stuart monarchy from social and economic turmoil as the judicial arm of the sovereign. Lord Jeffries likened alchemy to witchcraft. You might term it a form of male witchcraft. Despite his very great and evidenced anxiety at appearing before Lord Jeffries, Newton had no more than a reprimand from Lord Jeffries. He was fortunate because at the same time Newton, who was passionately anti-Catholic, he was a very fundamentalist Protestant, had encountered Lord Jeffries in Jeffries' role as head of the Commission for Ecclesiastical Causes. The commission investigated Cambridge University's refusal to admit to office anyone who did not swear an oath of allegiance to the Anglican faith. The investigation led to the Vice Chancellor of the university, a man called Peachel, being stripped of that office and of its lucrative trappings. One of the other curious outcomes of the alchemy episode is that it might explain why, at the height of his career, Newton, in 1695, instead of accepting a professorship at Cambridge, took up an appointment successfully as warden and then director of the Royal Mint. He had responsibility for securing and accounting for England's repository of gold. And as I mentioned earlier, he put the UK on the gold, or England, I should say, on the gold standard. And one must speculate that if Newton had made the breakthroughs in alchemy, he could have certainly augmented the country's gold reserves ad infinitum. Turning now to Sir Robert Hooke. Sir Robert Hooke was a polymath who lived from 1635 to 1703. He was briefly active as a physicist, astronomer, geologist, meteorologist, and architect. He is credited as one of the first scientists to investigate living things at microscopic scale. It started in 1665, using a compound microscope that he designed. Hooke was an impoverished scientific inquirer in young adulthood who went on to become one of the most famous scientists of his time. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, Hooke, as a surveyor and architect, attained wealth and esteem by performing more than half the property line surveys and assisting with the city's rapid reconstruction after the Great Fire. But often vilified by writers in centuries after his death, his reputation was restored by a number of biographical and scientific works in the 20th century, and he's actually been called the England's Leonardo da Vinci. Perhaps that might be going too far. Hooke was a Fellow of the Royal Society, and from 1662 he was its first curator of experiments. From 1665 to 1703, as many will know, he was also Professor of Geometry at Gresham College. Hooke began his scientific career as an assistant to the physical scientist Robert Boyle, who was mentioned earlier. Hooke built the vacuum pumps that were used in Boyle's experiments on gas law and also conducted some of the experiments with him. And in 1664, Hooke identified rotations of Mars and Jupiter. Hooke's 1665 book, Micrographia, in which he coined the term cell, encourages microscopic investigating optics and specifically light refraction. Hooke inferred a wave theory of light. This is the first recorded hypothesis of the cause of expansion of heat, of air's composition by small particles in constant motion, and thus generates its pressure and of heat as energy. And in physics, Hooke inferred that gravity obeys an inverse square law, and arguably was the first to hypothesize such a relationship in planetary motion, a principle, incidentally, which Isaac Newton furthered and formalized in Isaac Newton's law of universal gravitation. And there was often a squabble into who had first insights into this discovery. But analysis shows that Newton and Hooke clashed at two levels, as personality and as physicists. On the one hand, you have Hooke, a gregarious man of gossip, a frequenter of coffee houses, and an indulger in port wine, someone who also frequently recorded his sexual exploits. Contrast Newton, who lived a life of isolation and austerity within the walls of Trinity College, Cambridge. On a scientific level, Newton had contempt for Hooke, whom he saw as a dabbler or dilettante. But in fairness to Hooke, he had a living to make at the Royal Society, and after the Great Fire of London, as I say, was one of the big surveyors who appointed to the City of London to initiate the rebuilding programme. So while recognising Newton's brilliance, Hooke saw Newton as an obsessive, self-opinionated man with an excessively rosy self-image. Both had immense egos, which exaggerated their different work styles and approaches to scientific analysis. Neither gave much credit to the other, unfortunately, and they became and remained bitter enemies until Hooke's death in 1703. Newton and Hooke clashed professionally on a number of scientific issues and publications, and time permits me really only to cite a couple of them. The disputes between Newton and Hooke started over Hooke's cursory treatment of Newton's theory of light and colours. Just as with current processes of peer review, it was the custom of the Royal Society to verify any serious scientific experiments presented to it. Hooke, as curator of experiments, had the job of analysing Newton's theories and writing a report on it. Hooke only gave Newton's theory cursory examination and review, and it later emerged that Newton's theory on the fundamental nature of light contradicted Hooke's own theory. As you might conjecture, the dispute was ripe with exchanges and counter-exchanges by the parties, fueled by their very different behaviour, styles and personalities. In 1678, Hooke published a paper, Lectiones Cutlerionia, which very much hypothesized the theory of gravity, similar to Newton. Their approaches to the subject was very different. Newton had employed years of practical research and complex mathematics, while Hooke employed some lucky guesses with skills of a self-publicist, born actually of hatred of fear of humiliation. In this clash over gravity, Hooke used mathematical relationships from earlier generations of physicists incorrectly, but ironically enough emerged with the correct answer. He presented his findings to the Royal Society, who did not twig the flaws. Such was Hooke's powers of persuasion and oratory. So, how does Newton emerge from this? Well, one can't dispute that Newton was certainly a giant among brilliant minds that drove scientific revolution. He's remembered as a transformative scholar, inventor, and prolific writer on all sorts of subjects. Newton eradicated any doubts about the heliocentric model of the universe by establishing celestial mechanics. His precise methodology gave rise to what is known as the scientific method. His theories of space, time, and gravity eventually gave way to those of Einstein. but Newton's work remains the bedrock on which modern physics was built. However, the episodes which I've discussed in this lecture do provide some less than glowing aspects of Newton's character, personality, and judgment. These traits do detract from perception of Newton as one of its foremost scientific treasures. Some of his character traits will be explained by modern behavioral scientists differently in such matters as mental health, personality disorders, and other scientific behavior which absorbs modern behavioral scientists. But I fear that is a separate subject of study, but I think it would be a very fruitful one. So, in conclusion, I look forward to any questions that may arise.
And thank you very much indeed. And yes, the questions are coming up, so do please raise any points that you have. The question of alchemy is a very interesting one. You mentioned the Multipliers Act of 1399, which banned it. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of detail about alchemy which comes up with Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canon's Yeoman's Tale, which comes in right at the end of the Canterbury Tales. They think it might even have been written after the main canon. There are two key characters who are frauds in alchemy, and the story goes into enormous detail as to how they go about it. There are a few lines which show that firstly Chaucer knew rather too much about alchemy, I think, just to be an outside bystander, and also gives us an insight into the kind of things that people were involved in at the time. He comes up with our urinals are pots for oil extraction, crucibles, alembic, beaker, good, retort, and other useless nonsense of that sort. And he does actually go on to explain quite how these two frauds managed to change fool's gold into the real stuff. And of course, it's suggested that Chaucer actually found out about this because he was involved in a fraud case involving a possible alchemist and some gold coins which had gone missing. But there we are. Right, all sorts of wonderful questions coming up, starting off with John Knight's. In the 18th century, today's better understood laws of nature and complex adaptive systems might have been considered as mystical and even heresy. As these laws are showing that Newton's laws are not the answer to everything, are we going in full circle? Now, Bob, does that mean to say we're going back to the alchemists?
Well, yeah. That's a very interesting question, John. I at the risk of being contentious and controversial, I wonder whether social media is a form of experiment that propels us absolutely right back into that direction with some of the dark forces that it unleashes of human nature. So I'm inclined to agree with your reflections, very much so.
Yes. Now we've got an interesting one coming up from John Wood about the social element of the time. Apparently Wren was a friend of both Hooke and Newton. So why didn't he manage to get the two back together? And John is, in fact, hang on, this is really more interesting. John is a high-resolution microscopist in his past, so he's a great fan of Robert Hooke, and I should hope so too.
Right. Well, I think first of all, Newton was not a naturally gregarious person, and while perhaps a coffee house might have been the best place to get these two protagonists together, I don't think Newton had that sort of social disposition. So I think it would have been the personalities were so different and contrasting that I think even a man of Sir Christopher Wren's might, power, and universality would have been challenged to do that. But very, very interesting to speculate why he didn't do that. But as I say, I think they were such contrasting personalities that it would have been a doomed one of Sir Christopher Wren's doomed ventures, and he had no doomed ventures to my knowledge.
Well, I think we might say that both Hooke and Newton were people of strong opinion, which might have been part of the problem. But anyway, John's come back with another interesting item for people. There's a good book by Rob Iliff called Priest of Nature, The Religious Worlds of Isaac Newton. So that might be worth having a look at. The other book I was going to mention is about Boyle, who was very much into alchemy. There's a book by Lawrence M. Principe from 1998 called Robert Boyle, The Aspiring Adept and His Alchemical Quest. So if anybody's interested in alchemy, that might be something to take a look at. Now, talking about fake news, Graham Elliott has raised an interesting point about Newton making a bad investment in a bubble market, which a man of his intellect must have understood to be flawed. Well, there are about 20,000 other people who might have had some kind of intellect who got defrauded by the South Sea bubble, I suppose. But do you think that Newton had self-doubt emotions which overwhelmed his logical acumen? I suspect it might have been just a matter of greed and a quick buck, but there we are. Well, what do you think, as a finance man, what is your opinion of the South Sea bubble?
Well, the South Sea bubble has been repeated on so many occasions, and even the great and the good, the most mature and prudent can get sucked into these things. Yes, I was aware of Newton's speculation in the South Sea bubble, and it did come as a surprise to me because obviously, as the keeper of the Royal Mint, as the person who put England on the gold standard and so on, one would have seen him as a very level-headed, mature, prudent person who saw the intrinsic value of gold and certainly wouldn't be tempted by forays such as the South Sea bubble, but he clearly was, and it must have been one of the few times when his stubbornness, his resolution got the better of him. But that's a very interesting insight, and it does give another dynamic, I think, to Isaac Newton's behavior and personality.
Well, of course, the South Sea bubble is really one of many. I mean, I usually mention to my students the Bank of Gibraltar and Rolls Razor, which both go back a long way, but goes to show the old adage, if it's too good to be true, then it isn't true. Krasinski has come up, it leads on to this actually rather nicely. Do any aspects of Newton's management of the Royal Mint shed light on his character? And interesting, of course, thinking about the Philosopher's Stone turning base metal into gold, like gold coins, as Chaucer's frauds almost managed to do. It is interesting, of course, that Newton did seem to have a thing about coinage. What do you think about his time at the Royal Mint, Bob?
Yes, I mean he was a very influential master of the Royal Mint, and as I said briefly in my lecture, he was not just a figurehead as previous master of the Royal Mint had been. He was conservative. It was at a time of great expansion of trade, and he certainly wanted to ensure that the coinage of England was indisputable, what was untarnished, and dare I say had much more reputation than perhaps the pound does today. So he was extremely good master of the Royal Mint, and again it shows a total contradiction to his time as a dabbler in alchemy. But no, he was a good active master of the Royal Mint, and I think his mastership of the Royal Mint did actually help support the credibility of the expansion of trade at that time, the time of Queen Anne and into the reign of George I, when the British trade was expanding very rapidly.
Yeah, I just thought I'd throw up this picture I came across the other day. In fact, I came across this years ago and had forgotten about it completely, and it popped up in the way one finds when surfing across different topics in preparation for a lecture like this. This is the Invisible College, which was one of the phrases used for the very early Gresham College before the Royal Society got its charter in 1662. And of course, they met both at Gresham and at Wadham. And the Illuminati of the period would have been able to look at this almost in the way that we might look at a political cartoon. There are all sorts of inferences and indications and suggestions from all the little pictures. There's a pilgrim bottom left. There's a man being lifted either up from a well or being dunked in and out of it, not quite sure which. There's somebody taking astronomical observations bottom right. Heaven knows what the swan is about. There are academics who have studied this kind of thing, and there are interesting books on the topic if anyone would like to follow up on it. But this apparently is an indication of the work of the Rosicrucians, another one of these esoteric groups of the time, where in fact we get this very interesting suggestion of being the last of the magicians and the first of the scientists, but a very interesting time. Robert Hooke, of course, was a demonstrator for the Royal Society, and some of their experiments were very serious, and some of them, of course, didn't really lead anywhere. The one I love is a very straightforward scientific question, Baconian principles. There are no snakes in Ireland. Now, everyone with a name like mine knows that St. Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland, whereupon they went to New York and became policemen. And so the question was, if there are no snakes in Ireland, can we drive snakes out of things like the newly found West Indian Islands, where snakes can be a bit of a problem? So they sent off to Ireland for a bucket of Irish soil, picked up a passing snake, dropped him onto the soil to see what happened. And of course, absolutely nothing did. But of course, the positive outcome from any kind of scientific experiment can be negative. And that's a good example of it. Now, coming back to alchemy, Michael Dury raises a question. Why is alchemy so despised? Michael, we didn't say it was despised. We just said we don't really quite understand it. But he does say many of today's important metals and fabrics are the result of change in the nature of the primary material. I think the key thing with the alchemy was turning base metal into gold. Bob, is there a secret coven of alchemists over in the Channel Islands?
I wish there were, because it certainly does need some public finances do need a boost here, but that's a separate topic of discussion, Tim. But I think it goes back to transformation, be it herbs into medicine, be it one metal into alloys, were seen as mystical things that were conducted by priests, head of religious orders, and sects, and so on. And so it did become, I suppose, connected with things that could not be explained. And as I say, Lord Jeffries saw it as the male equivalent of witchcraft. Witchcraft was indulged in transformative things, and so that's how it got its association. But no, Michael is right that there is a lot of transformation that goes on these days, combining metals, transforming metals into alloys, and so on. So it's a perfectly respectable activity. I think it's just that the word alchemy has an unfortunate historic pedigree.
Well, that's interesting what you say, Bob, because of course we have to bear in mind in the time of Isaac Newton, witchcraft was a very, very dangerous topic. It wasn't banned in Britain until 1736, and the last witch to be burnt alive was in Scotland in 1727, when you would have thought the more rational thought, especially with the Scottish Enlightenment, might have prevailed. But this unfortunate woman, Janet Horne, was actually covered in tar and ignited, so not very nice. Now, the other interesting thing there you mentioned was the religious and heads of houses. Of course, the name that springs to mind is Roger Bacon. And
exactly.
Here is someone who is really experimenting and looking at things. Brings to mind an interesting short story by Rudyard Kipling called The Eye of Allah, where Roger Bacon brings back, or a friar brings back an early microscope from his time in Spain, and the abbot is frightened by what they discover by looking down it. linking in again to Robert Hooke and that fabulous drawing of a flea,
Yeah.
which astonished everybody. Samuel Pepys actually stayed up all night reading his Micrographia when it first came out in 1665. So, yes, it's not an open and closed question. And of course,
Yeah.
the interesting thing here is the human intellect. There is a question. We go back to the Royal Society. There is a question. Can you answer it? And what we call Baconian principles are in fact coming in round about this kind of time. Now, now Matthew Leach is getting us back onto the subject. Which of Newton's achievements were most responsible for his progress in society and his knighthood?
Well, it must be on gravity, I suppose. That's what he is mostly known for. But some of his other work, which perhaps is more deeply scientific, I think resonates as much. He was already master of the Royal Mint by the time he was knighted, I should say, before he was master of the Royal Mint. But I don't think one should underestimate his achievement as master of the Royal Mint, which I say was a very active role and in fundamentally supporting trade. I mean, the Bank of England had been formed by that time. It was 1694, wasn't it, when the Bank of England was formed? But that had a very different role. But the Royal Mint was fundamental in giving credibility to British coinage. So I actually think despite his scientific brilliance for which he's known, I think from an economic point of view, his time as master of the Royal Mint was very important and perhaps hasn't been researched and investigated and evaluated sufficiently.
Yes, it's rather interesting. We're thinking, coming back to Michael's theme of Connect to Prosper for the year, he likes to remind people that they're more science and technology related people in the City of London than finance and business. But rather interesting, we seem to look at Newton much more in terms of the science rather than the commercial elements of the Royal Mint. So someone out there, there's your chance. You can write a book about Newton and his time at the Mint. Now, questions are flooding in now. Well, Charles Radcliffe, now stand to attention, folks. My namesake ancestor was a Grand Master of the Priory of Sion. His immediate predecessor is alleged to have been Sir Isaac Newton. Was his relationship with Catholicism more complex, perhaps? Now, again, 1720s, quite a dangerous question, actually, for that period.
Well, I mean, historically, Newton was a very fundamentalist, if I could put it like that. Much of a contrast to Lord Jeffries, who was extremely high church. Now, whether after the Glorious Revolution and perhaps the Catholicism taking very much of a back seat, that he ameliorated himself, I don't know. Again, it will be another fruitful area for research as to Newton's latter-day religious persuasions. But certainly at his time at Cambridge, he was a fundamentalist, and he, among others, opposed the opening of Cambridge University to those who would not or could not take the Anglican oath of allegiance. So he may well have changed later in life.
Well, isn't it the fact that was it the Master of Trinity who was deprived of his position? I think you said this in your lecture.
That's right.
He refused to sign. Yes. So it was a very, very controversial topic and almost a dangerous one, I think, in the period.
That's right. Again, this was being pushed by James II through his through Lord Jeffries, and yes, there was a big hearing about this, and Peacher was actually demolished. It's quite a graphic account of how Jeffries demolished Peacher in public with his withering and acid comments.
Yes, well, the Glorious Revolution sums it all up. So yes, a controversial
Does
period.
indeed.
Now, an interesting one from Marcellus Lopez Alves here. Robert Hooke was older and a much more established scientist than the young Newton. So why did the Royal Society not fight for Hooke's rights on the discoveries about mass proportional attraction? Is this Hooke's law?
Yes. Um, I mean, uh, my, my albeit brief readings into the Royal Society was that I mean Hooke, as the question says, was older. He was much more, dare I say, he was more PR savvy, as we'd say these days. He could articulate well. He could present well, probably much better than Newton could. I could imagine Newton going into a presentation with loads of papers, too much detail, which might have confused or dare I say bored some of those who were more interested in immediate headlines. But Newton did a lot of very much detailed experiments. He built up empirically using his own material, extensive notes and so on. Whereas, dare one say, Hooke perhaps borrowed, as I think I indicated in one of my illustrations. He borrowed from others and he put his own interpolation on it. Perhaps is the right way, but I suppose I don't want to take sides, but clearly Newton would come out in rankings higher than Hooke, but at the time Hooke was Hooke was a certainly much better presenter in my view.
Well, there's also, I think, the point that Hooke was very much the practical hands-on man, particularly with his work regarding the reconstruction of the City of London. And we have to bear in mind that Newton, shall we say, was not a man to suffer fools gladly. We look at his spat with Leibniz over the invention of the log tables, and dog it does not describe the way that Newton went into it. And of course, there's the famous story, I don't know whether it's apocryphal or not, that Newton deliberately burnt the portraits of Robert Hooke in order to eradicate his memory. And Hooke, in fact, until we reinstated him at Gresham College in the late 20th century, being one of our professors, and dear old Mike Cooper went into enormous detail about how significant Hooke was. And he had, I think, been overlooked very much by scientific historians. Now, folks, I'm sorry to say that we do allow officially 20 minutes for questions, but bearing in mind that Michael Manelli's theme for the year is Connect to Prosper, there's a wonderful story which I must introduce you to with regard to the monument, which of course was designed by Hooke, and people don't necessarily know it was designed to be a telescope. And one of Hooke's plans was to be able to prove that the Earth goes round the sun and not the other way round. And his attempt to prove this was frustrated because he didn't have instruments which were sensitive enough to get over the rumblings of horse-drawn traffic going up and down past the monument itself. Now, the Worshipful Company of Scientific Instrument Makers, who else, are setting up an experiment along with City University, which involves 300 meters of optic fiber cable, which are being strung up and down the monument. This is being connected to the hall of said Worshipful Company of Scientific Instrument Makers on the other side of the Thames, and they're going to proceed with Hooke's experiment to see whether he could actually have anticipated Copernicus by proving, in fact, that the Earth does indeed go around the sun. This is going to be going on for the next few months, so do watch out. Perhaps keep an eye out for the web page of the Worshipful Company of Scientific Instrument Makers, and we can find out rather more about that. But I think that's a really rather good story. Now, thanks very much to Bob McDowell. We're grateful for all of these insights into Newton and Hooke. Very interesting men in their own right, but I don't think they're commonly drawn together in the way that we have done this morning. Now, just to remind, this lecture, all the lectures are recorded, posted on the Gresham Society website, on the YouTube channel. You can go straight into knowledgemiles.net if you want, so you can revisit everything. We hope to see you at one of our forthcoming lectures. Here we are, 22nd, 23rd, 24th of May. You've got nothing on that week. You've got the Achilles heel of AI. We're doing quite a lot on AI, as you might imagine, at the moment. Going back to business on the 23rd, the right questions about profit, how to make one would be a very useful lecture. And you'll see me again on the 24th of May because I'll be introducing the UK-India relationship, very current topic at the present time. And in the meanwhile, please don't forget the Mayor's theme for the year, Connect to Prosper. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Bob, and goodbye.